Why Suge Knight could never intimidate Eminem. Suge Knight was the kind of name that could make an entire room go quiet. People in the music industry weren't simply nervous around him. According to those who lived through that era, many of them were genuinely terrified. Suge didn't build Death Row Records by being friendly. He built it through power, fear, and a reputation for taking things much further than most executives ever would. Over the years, former employees, artists, and industry insiders have accused him of everything from brutal beatings to humiliating acts of intimidation. Some stories even claimed he threatened people by hanging them over balconies until they agreed to sign contracts. Not every story surrounding Suge has been proven, but the fear attached to his name was absolutely real. People called him the boogeyman of the music business. And honestly, that description doesn't even sound exaggerated when you hear the stories. There was one rapper, however, who never seemed impressed by any of it. Eminem? Suge could send messages. He could surround people with his crew. He could lean on the reputation he had spent years building. But Marshall Mathers refused to act scared. And according to the people who witnessed their encounters, that wasn't just an image Eminem created for his music. When the situation became real, he still stood his ground. That fearless attitude was put to the test during one of the biggest nights in hip-hop. The 1,999 Source Awards? At the time, Eminem was still relatively new to the mainstream. The Slim Shady LP had recently been released. My Name Is was everywhere. And people throughout the industry were beginning to realize that Dr. Dre's new artist wasn't going away anytime soon. Eminem may have been a rookie, but he was already one of the most talked about rappers in the country. That night, he had been invited to present the award for Best Live Performer to DMX. To viewers watching at home, everything appeared normal. Eminem walked onto the stage, presented the award, and handled himself like any other celebrity at a major event. But according to former members of his security team, something much more serious was happening before the cameras started rolling. As Eminem made his way toward his seat, a group of men wearing red shirts allegedly surrounded him. The men were said to be connected to Death Row Records. One security guard later recalled watching the situation unfold from the side of the room. He could see Eminem being cut off. He could see the group closing in around him, and he immediately knew something wasn't right. When he asked what was happening, someone allegedly told him that Suge Knight was sending a message. That's the kind of moment where most people would panic. Eminem didn't. He stayed calm. He excused himself. He walked onto the stage and presented the award to DMX. Then he returned to his seat like nothing had happened. Personally, I think that reaction tells you more about Eminem than any lyric ever could. Anyone can sound fearless inside a recording booth. It's completely different when several intimidating men are standing right in front of you. But the tension apparently didn't end inside the building. When Eminem and his security team left, the ceremony members of the Death Row crew were reportedly still waiting outside. The team called for their limousine. As they headed toward the vehicle, they realized the same people were behind them. According to the security guards, the entire situation felt unpredictable. Nobody knew whether the men wanted to start a fight, send another warning, or do something even worse. Eminem was apparently prepared to defend himself if the situation turned physical, but the bigger question was obvious. Why was Suge Knight paying so much attention to a young rapper who had only recently become famous? To understand that, you have to look at what was happening to Death Row Records behind the scenes. During the mid-1990s, Death Row was one of the most successful labels in music. Dr. Dre released The Chronic. Snoop Dogg released Doggy Style. Tupac released All Eyes on Me. These weren't just successful albums. They helped define an entire generation of hip-hop. For a while, Death Row looked untouchable. But behind the hit records, the label was developing a much darker reputation. Former employees have described an environment built around fear, control, and violence. According to multiple accounts, Suge didn't simply fire people who made him angry. He allegedly punished them physically. One story claimed 2 rappers were forced to remove their clothes at gunpoint before being beaten for using office phones without permission. Other former employees claimed Suge would take people into a storage room and assault them behind closed doors. Workers could reportedly hear shouting, crying, and sounds of violence through the walls. But almost nobody stepped in. They kept their heads down, they acted like they couldn't hear anything, and they hoped they wouldn't be the next person called into that room. Over time, that behavior allegedly spread throughout the company. Violence and intimidation became part of the culture surrounding Death Row. The label was making incredible music, but the environment behind that music was becoming increasingly chaotic. Dr. Dre wanted no part of it. Dre cared about producing records. He wanted to work in the studio. He didn't want to spend his life surrounded by threats, street conflicts, and constant drama. Eventually, he made one of the biggest decisions of his career. He walked away from Death Row, and according to Dre, he left a huge amount of money behind. Royalties, ownership, future earnings. He gave it all up because the situation had become unbearable. That decision showed exactly how serious things had become. Most people don't walk away from millions of dollars unless staying feels even more dangerous. Dre later explained that he had never allowed money to control his life. He believed in his own talent, and he was willing to start over. So he created Aftermath Entertainment. Suge reportedly saw Dre's departure as a betrayal. From his perspective, Dre hadn't simply left a record label. He had abandoned an empire they had built together. And Suge allegedly wanted to make sure Dre regretted that decision. At first, he didn't need to do much. Aftermath struggled during its early years. Compared with the massive success of Death Row, Dre's first few projects under the new label didn't make the same impact. People began wondering whether he had lost his touch. Some critics questioned whether Dre could still create hits without the Death Row machine behind him. Then one cassette changed everything. While listening through demo recordings with music executive Jimmy Iovine, Dre heard a voice unlike anything else in hip-hop. The rapper was Eminem, a young artist from Detroit who was broke, frustrated, and desperately trying to get noticed. Marshall had grown up in poverty. He had been raised mainly by his mother. He had dealt with bullying, unstable housing, and constant rejection. Instead of destroying his ambition, those experiences gave him something to write about. He spent years battling inside Detroit's underground rap scene. Being a white rapper in a genre dominated by black artists created another obstacle. Many people dismissed him before they even heard him. Others assumed he was copying a culture that didn't belong to him. But once Eminem started rapping, it was hard to ignore the talent. His delivery was sharp, his humor was dark, his energy was explosive, and his lyrics sounded completely different from almost everything else being released at the time. Dre took a chance on him. In 1998, Eminem signed with Aftermath. Together, they created the Slim Shady LP. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. It reportedly sold around 283,000 copies during its first week. It later earned Eminem the Grammy Award for Best Rap Album. Just like that, Dre was back on top. And Eminem had become one of the biggest new stars in music. Their partnership quickly became one of the most important relationships in hip-hop. Dre gave Eminem credibility, resources, and production. Eminem gave Aftermath the breakout superstar the label desperately needed. But while Dre and Eminem were rising, Death Row was falling apart. Tupac had been killed. Suge was dealing with legal problems and eventually returned to prison. Dr. Dre was gone, and Snoop Dogg had become increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the label. Snoop never wanted to remain trapped inside the East Coast versus West Coast conflict. He continued speaking with artists whom Suge allegedly viewed as enemies. That created even more tension between them. Snoop later described feeling threatened and afraid for his life. Eventually, he left Death Row too. With Dre, Tupac, and Snoop all gone, the label had lost the stars who had made it powerful. The empire Suge had built was beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, Dre and Eminem were selling millions of albums, winning awards, and becoming cultural icons. From Suge's perspective, Eminem may have represented more than another successful rapper. He was proof that Dre had survived leaving Death Row. Even worse, Dre had built a new empire without Suge. Some people believe Eminem inherited Dre's conflict the moment he signed with Aftermath. Suge allegedly saw their success as a personal attack, and from that point forward, Eminem became one of his targets. Suge began questioning whether Eminem was authentic. During a 2002 interview with Howard Stern, he suggested that if a white rapper genuinely came from a rough environment and wrote his own lyrics, he could respect him. But he also implied that some artists were simply performing stories created by other people. The message seemed obvious. Suge wanted listeners to question whether Eminem was really the person described in his music. But words weren't the only method allegedly used to intimidate him. According to people close to Eminem, there were several situations where Suge or members of his circle appeared unexpectedly. One incident reportedly happened during a trip involving Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Eminem. The group believed they were going on a relaxed vacation with their families. But when the plane landed, police officers were waiting. According to one account, authorities warned the group that death row associates were nearby. The trip suddenly didn't feel like a vacation anymore. Then came the most famous confrontation of them all. During the filming of 50 Cent's Into Club music video, Suge Knight reportedly arrived with a large group of men. People on set immediately became nervous. Word spread that Suge was outside. Members of the crew started moving around. Some people tried to avoid the confrontation completely. According to witnesses, Suge had arrived with men connected to a Los Angeles street gang. For people from New York who weren't used to that environment, the sight was intimidating. The tattoos, the numbers, the size of the group, everything about the situation suggested that something serious could happen. But Eminem didn't hide inside. He walked directly outside to confront them. That moment shocked the people around him. One witness later said that was when he realized Eminem was genuinely fearless. Marshall wasn't pretending to be tough for the cameras. He saw Suge and the group outside, and his attitude was basically that if there was a problem, they could deal with it right there. According to those telling the story, Suge eventually walked away. The men with him appeared confused. They may have expected Eminem to back down. Instead, he had walked toward them. And honestly, that may have been the last reaction they expected from a skinny white rapper from Detroit. Despite all of this, Eminem rarely attacked Suge publicly during that period. That wasn't necessarily because he was afraid. In his 2004 song Like Toy Soldiers, Eminem explained that Dr. Dre had asked him to stay out of certain conflicts. Dre understood how quickly rap feuds could become real violence. He didn't want Eminem inserting himself into a situation that had started years before they met. So Eminem stepped back, he kept quiet, and according to his lyrics, he held his anger inside out of respect for Dre. That restraint is important. People often confuse silence with fear, but sometimes staying quiet requires more control than fighting back. Eminem had the platform to attack Suge. He had the lyrics ready. He simply chose not to release everything he had recorded. Years later, Suge continued taking shots at him. During an episode of the podcast Collect Call with Suge Knight, he criticized Eminem's work on Tupac's posthumous album Loyal to the Game. Suge claimed almost every Tupac project had succeeded except the one Eminem produced. Calling the album a complete failure is a stretch. Loyal to the Game debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It also achieved platinum status. Commercially, the album performed well, but Suge's criticism wasn't entirely invented either. The project received mixed reactions from fans. In 2003, Eminem had reportedly contacted Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, and asked for permission to produce a posthumous album honoring her son. She agreed. The project was released the following year. Some listeners appreciated the effort. Others believed the production sounded too modern and polished. They felt Tupac's original West Coast energy had been replaced by Eminem's darker style. To those fans, the album sounded more like an Eminem project featuring Tupac than an authentic Tupac record. So while Suge exaggerated by calling it a failure, he was touching on a criticism some Tupac fans already shared. Eminem never responded directly to those comments, at least not publicly. Then, years later, an unreleased Eminem diss track surfaced online. The track was called Smack You. It had reportedly been recorded during the mid-2000s. And once fans heard it, they understood why Dre may have wanted Eminem to keep it locked away. The song targeted both Ja Rule and Suge Knight. Eminem mocked Ja Rule's appearance and attacked him as a father. Then he turned his attention toward Suge. The accusations became far more serious. Eminem blamed Suge for the deaths of Tupac and Biggie. Those claims have never been established as fact. Suge has denied responsibility for the murders. But the lyrics showed exactly what Eminem had been willing to say privately during the height of their conflict. Some listeners called Smack You one of the most brutal diss tracks Eminem had ever recorded. Others believed releasing it at the time could have placed him in genuine danger. That may be true. Hip-hop during that era wasn't just about internet arguments and social media posts. Major conflicts could quickly move beyond music. People had already died. Labels were connected to street organizations, and Suge's reputation made every threat feel more serious. Yet Eminem still recorded the song. Even if he never officially released it, Marshall was clearly prepared to say what he believed. And that brings us back to the biggest point of this entire story. Eminem never seemed intimidated by Suge Knight. He respected Dr. Dre enough to stay out of Dre's old conflict. But when Suge's people surrounded him, Eminem didn't panic. When they waited outside an award show, he didn't hide. When Suge arrived at the In the Club video shoot, Eminem walked directly toward him. And when Eminem finally put his anger into a diss track, he didn't soften the message. That doesn't mean every story about these encounters happened exactly as people remember it. Some of the details come from interviews given years later. Memories change, stories grow, and the legends surrounding both Eminem and Suge Knight can make every confrontation sound even more dramatic. But there's one detail that remains consistent across almost every account. Eminem refused to back down. Maybe that came from growing up in Detroit. Maybe it came from years of fighting for respect in rap battles. Or maybe Eminem simply understood that fear only gives someone like Suge more power. Whatever the reason, Suge's usual intimidation tactics never appeared to work on him. Suge Knight built his reputation by making people believe he was willing to do anything. Eminem built his reputation by acting like he had nothing to lose. When those two personalities collided, neither one wanted to give the other control. The difference was that Eminem didn't need violence to win. He had Dr. Dre behind him. He had millions of fans. He had one of the sharpest pens in hip-hop, and he was becoming more powerful with every album he released. Suge may have once been the most feared man in the music industry, but Eminem was one of the few artists who looked at that reputation and simply didn't care. And whether you believe every story or not, that fearlessness became another part of the Slim Shady legend. The next video you should watch is our full breakdown of the war between Dr. Dre and Suge Knight. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.